Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to the Solutions Watch. I am James Corbett of CorbettReport.com here in February of 2025 with something completely different than the way things usually roll. Usually, I'm the one in charge. I have a plan and an agenda, and I'm here to tell you about a specific solution. But this time, I guess we're going to flip the mic around a little bit, and I am going to be subject to some questions that I have seen in advance, but I have not prepared my answers because I want them to be somewhat spontaneous and I want the conversation to be a little more free-flowing. So let's bring today's guest, or is that interviewer, on to Solutions Watch and introduce him to you. It's Adam Deng, who people may or may not know was a co-creator or founder of the MIT Students for Open Inquiry, which is a fascinating thing that I don't know if you want to get into that history and what happened there, but if so, please do. If not, could you just introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. Welcome all Corbetteers. My name is Adam Deng. I'm currently an MIT PhD student in operations research, and I founded the MIT Students for Open Inquiry in fall of 2023. You may remember when we got a few famous guests over to MIT to discuss various aspects with alternative viewpoints, or just going against the grain of what is usually said and done in academia. We brought in 4 different people. Some of you might recognize Derek Brose. That was the last speaker we had in the fall, and we brought him over to talk about agorism and alternative technologies and how to opt out of the technocratic state. We also had Steve Kirsch. That was probably the biggest event with over 250 people who came into the aptly named Kirsch Auditorium to discuss vaccines. And before that, we also had Dr. Shiva talking about technologies and email, as well as Hirsch Singh from the Republican side discussing his journey into politics and how he maneuvers around the space nowadays. I was an undergrad at the time that I did that, and my focus has always been in mathematics and artificial intelligence. The way in which I look at the world is very quantitative, so when I think of objects or I think of what I see in front of me, what comes to mind first is usually numbers or shapes and colors and how they move around. And I call this on my website, I say this is the triplex mindset because it's the merger of numbers, shapes, and how they move around. So when I see, for example, in the Tom and Jerry show, when I see Spike the dog, who sometimes appears, the number 2378 comes to mind. When I think of the Egyptian pyramids, that's 3912. Numbers just pop into my head in and out, and I believe that the world can be constructed through a mathematical lens. So that is how I view the world. In my PhD, I work with high-dimensional statistics, and my goal is to find ways to take complicated and noisy data and discover heuristics and shortcuts and other algorithms for ways to compute high-dimensional statistics that generally are not tractable because the amount of calculation required is simply too big. As an undergrad, I also worked to write a paper on joint optimization, which is finding better vehicle routes for 2 sets of different vehicles, and we managed to make what otherwise looks to be like a traveling salesman problem calculatable. So that is my big passion, is to take unorganized data, distill it in a mathematical manner, and make it accessible. So that's my big mission. And the reason I'm here on Solutions Watch is because one of my biggest problems in life so far has been, as you may have anticipated, the verbal space, meaning words, their specific meanings, thinking about the world in a verbal direction. That's not my natural strength, but I figure that right now, when I'm writing research papers, when I want to think about the more philosophical or social issues, especially in law or in how to defeat the deep state or how we can strategize and organize, that is by nature a more diplomatic, personal, and especially verbal type of communication that I don't believe can be encapsulated through mathematics alone. And as a child, I like to read nonfiction. I like to read the mathematical textbooks, but I always struggled with fiction and interpreting how characters react and all of that. And I believe that right now, it is time for me to unpack the power of words and how they work. And I hope that today on Solutions Watch, we can all learn from James on how to indeed crack the verbal puzzle and to see what we can do.
Well, let's see what we can do. I take 3 things away from what you just said, one of which is our minds, I think, truly do operate in different ways. The second of which is you say you struggle with the verbal space and linguistics, but given that you just did 2 or 3 minutes of completely uninterrupted, totally comprehensible and coherent thought without a single pause, stutter, or verbal tick of any kind, I would say that's that in itself is impressive. I think not a lot of people could do that. And thirdly, it sounds like you're the person who's going to be training our new AI robot overlords. So please train them to go easy on me if you can. But all right. So yes, as Adam said there, we're going to be talking about improving the verbal today and all the different aspects that come with that, linguistic terrain and how to navigate it. And I guess that is what I do, and it is certainly, that is more of my background. As I always say, the only thing I'm actually trained in is the analysis of literature. I have my bachelor's degree in English literature and my master's in Anglo-Irish literature, so that's the only thing I'm actually qualified with a piece of paper to talk about. So why don't I actually talk whatever I can about that? And I understand you have some questions ready for me, so let's get into them.
Actually, James, I think you may have unwittingly opened up the bonus box, which I wanted to discuss at the very end, but it's about my division of language into what I like to call fundamental verbal and extroverted verbal. So sometimes when I ask people about how to get better at words, or what you just said, that I was able to speak 2 or 3 minutes uninterrupted without a single filler word, actually I would say that that's what I would categorize as extroverted verbal, which is the ability to express oneself openly, for lengths, for long periods of time, and with different degrees of nuance, and just travel around the journey for whoever is listening. I think that's more of a presentational aspect that you just develop. Perhaps it's just internally you're confident when you're speaking to a large audience, or you want to get your thoughts out. So what I would say that in this aspect, I do love doing it. I love writing on my website. I love to give talks and conversations. I don't think I do that enough. But the aspect of the verbal that I am here to learn from you about is what I call fundamental verbal, which is words as a basis, or how to conceptualize the world in terms of words, and how to, I could, sure, if you gave me a book, I could read it in front of an audience, but I think that I would be missing many of the subtleties, or how the different paragraphs connect to each other, or if I were to write an analysis of what the author means. I think that that's an area where I would have some improvement to do. So with that being said, I did ask 6 questions to you, James, and as a matter of fact, I wanted to thank the 8 people who I sent these 6 questions to, and who come from 4 different continents, including you, James. I'm going to include you in these 8, but I've asked these questions to people I consider to be great at words, and you all have given me some form of interpretation on the questions, suggestions I could do, and some of you have written me long essays and had calls with me about this, so I wanted to thank you for this. We're definitely going to be incorporating many of the suggestions that you laid down. It's been about a month, so I've had time for these ideas to percolate, but my first question has to be, why and how do words resonate with and speak to you? I can remember shapes and numbers because I can visualize them, but I forget words all the time.
Okay, let me start thinking about my process of thinking and how that relates to the linguistic. I think I do fundamentally see the world in terms of language. And I say that because I don't know if this makes a difference, but I know that people have different ways of envisioning ideas and objects and other things. I would say primarily, for example, if I'm thinking of the word water, I do not picture the ocean. I do not picture a visual representation of water. I picture the word water, W-A-T-E-R. That is what I see in my head, generally speaking. And obviously, I think that when it's embedded in narrative and I'm reading a book, I do see the images from the book and what have you in my mind. But I'm very much aware of the verbal aspect of it, the linguistic aspect of it, because I think to a certain extent, I see the nature of our reality embedded in a linguistic context in which there are linguistic relations that in some way shape our perceptions of the world. And perhaps one way of envisioning that is the concept of collocation, which is, I think, something that probably large language models essentially are designed to find, adduce, and reproduce, which is certain words tend to go together, and they create certain ideas in our mind. So if you see the word crystal, often it's going to be succeeded by the word clear, crystal clear. That concept goes together. And that embodies a sort of a shared cultural understanding that people, the English speakers, generally have of what that word means. Those words mean crystal clear. That's just one example of it. So you don't say something is clear, you say it's crystal clear, and people understand that it resonates in a slightly different way than if you said simply, that's clear. And I see the world as all of those types of relations, ones that we're aware of, like those types of words that clearly go together, crystal clear go together, and other ones that we are less aware tend to go together, but that shape our reality. And one way of getting a handle on that, of course, is to study another language. As I have done a couple of times in my life, more or less successfully. I tend to think I'm very verbose, and my loquacity in English is second to none. But for some reason, I am not good at picking up foreign languages. So I have studied French, obviously being a Canadian. I studied French for many years and can barely speak it. Can read it a little. And I've lived in Japan for 20 years, and I can get by, but I am not completely fluent in Japanese in all aspects. But at the very least, the thing that I always loved about taking foreign language lessons is that moment when you start to almost perceive the world in a slightly different way. You start to see how different grammatical constructions come together that create a slightly different way of even thinking about the world. The obvious example of that are words that simply don't exist in English. For example, I've always loved the word wasuremono in Japanese, which is literally like a lost thing. So something that you have left behind on the bus or whatever is a wasuremono. And we don't have a singular word for that in English. That's always just been interesting to me. But it can be, I think it's much, much deeper than that. For example, in Japanese, you don't tend to use the pronouns to address specific people that you're talking about. You don't say, you don't talk about this. When you're talking about a person or a subject, generally the subject is assumed. So you kind of you omit that from your sentence, which creates a certain ambiguity, which requires more from the listener. They have to understand the context and sometimes have to fill in the context, which is, I think, one reason why, as I think is stereotypically true, Asian cultures tend to have more emphasis on for example, actually, this has been found even at the biological level that for people in Asian cultures, when they are looking, for example, at a picture, tend to spend more time. Their eyes tend to concentrate more on the outer edges of the picture and other parts of it, whereas Westerners tend to focus on the central part of the picture. If it's a picture of a person, you look simply at the person, but Asians are looking at the context of the person more so. And I think that is partly a reflection of the language itself. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it more of a proclivity to favor context that creates language that favors context, or is it the language that is creating reality? I think it's the latter. I think our language develops, and yes, there is some aspect to which that is an expression of ourselves and the way that we think, but to some extent, I think it directs us to think in certain ways.
I see. So I would actually take the opposite opinion, which is I think that reality handed down to us will then generate the language that we see around us. I also love foreign languages. I think that oftentimes one of the neglected connections, I would say, in terms of language as a verbal construct is the people who are good at literature don't interact very often, at least from what I see, with the people who learn a lot of languages. Maybe this is because when you're dealing with literature, it tends to be about emotional nuance and within a language, how to be the most expressive, how to find that key word that puts your idea in the best and most optimal way. You know, you don't want a generic word like big. Giant isn't good enough either. You want enormous or something like that. So those people, I would say, are more qualitative in how they think. And there are language learners who like to look around for different languages, and that tends to be a more syntactical and grammatical driven venture. So I know English.
Perhaps the exceptions that prove the rule, but let me give two interjections there. One is James Joyce, who knew something on the order of, I think, 19 languages. He learnt Norwegian simply so he could correspond with Henrik Ibsen in his own language, which is amazing. But also one of my other favorite writers in the English language, Joseph Conrad, English was his fifth language. Just one of those people who could pick things up and anyway, that, yes. But as you say, I think there generally is that distinction because, and maybe you are correct on that. Maybe your inclination is true there because yes, there is such an attention to the detail of this specific language that when those people who are very interested in, say, literature and the nuance of language go into a foreign language space, they don't want to be basically babies babbling again. They want to have that fullness and richness of language that they experience in their original language. Maybe I'll use that as an excuse as to why I'm not so good at foreign languages.
Yeah, you've gone so deep in English, it's like the world just wouldn't look the same if you were in any other language.
Yeah.
For me, I think that there are definitely authors and writers who have the best of both, as in they can learn a lot of languages with flexibility and they can express themselves with nuance, and also at the same time continue their repository of detailed knowledge in a certain language. I would say for the most part, though, the split is still there. And for myself, I do like learning different languages. I know English, Chinese, and German. So Japanese should only be a small hop away if kanji really is that big of a deal. And I want to merge the two fields. And by that I mean of language learning, of observing syntax and grammar rules and how they go together to being able to communicate in a language, as well as being able to decipher what makes literature in a particular language great. I think that one is regarded as language learning is usually statistical, and understanding English literature or the English language as a communication affair tends to be more about verbal nuances as verbal encounters rather than statistical or rules or logical based encounters. So I do think that there is much to be said about if I can tap into perhaps my knowledge of German or Chinese to help me understand how English words work. That could be a big benefit to me, because what I have noticed is that Chinese characters have been adapted around the world, especially in East Asia. Japan is, I believe, the only other country whose language has kept the Chinese characters. Vietnam, after being ruled by France, just completely got rid of it and went to a Latin system that I don't even know how to pronounce all of those accents. Korean just invented a whole new alphabet, even though if you listen to it, I can't actually figure it out by listening to it because it sounds different from Chinese. But if you look at how it's sounded out, you can actually see most of the remnants of the Chinese culture in there. And if what I've discovered is that if I can make languages fill the space of robustness a little bit more, I think that I can get better at discovering the types of connections. And what I mean by that is, I think that in terms of, you can imagine the world and what we observe as a very high dimensional space. So maybe you can represent objects and things and movies in terms of where objects are, what time span they are, what color they are, where they are located, what they have done to you. Basically, you can think of the entities of our observable reality as a very long string of numbers, each representing an aspect of it. This is in fact what large language models and AI generation of images do. They just turn images and words into very long vectors, and they're called embeddings. But if you can imagine reality as embeddings, I think that given how complex the world is, and given the fact that language, the world's languages are not separated by much, really. It's just, I think mostly it's the same ideas being conveyed from a slightly different perspective, or relationships, correlations between different ideas, that I don't think languages by themselves can fill up the high dimensional space of our reality.
Yeah.
So that is why I believe that
resonates so strongly with me, because I think if I really drilled down on it, one of the reasons I am so interested in language and love to play around with it is because I don't know how to measure this, but I feel that I am much more acutely aware of the disconnect between language and the real world than most people tend to be. Most people think Apple is Apple and it's the same thing. But I don't know. I've just always intuitively had that sense, that, to put it in the deconstructionist language, of the difference between the sign and the signified. I've always been aware of that gulf, and it is an unbridgeable gulf. We have these words that we are using to represent the world, but I mean, they don't represent the world in all of its high dimensional complexity. And I'm very aware of that. And I think that's part of the reason why I like language and the idea of playing around in language to try to find better ways of representing this idea or that idea. And I'm fine with the fact that there is no, I don't think there is a right or wrong. There's no definitive absolutes in this space. It is more like a type of play in which you can engage in, and sometimes you hit something and it'll spark something in someone else's mind. That, to me, is what this is all about, is trying to convey something to another human being. And I find that is almost like the unbridgeable gulf. So whenever you even have a glimmer of that type of spark of recognition in someone else, when you're able to put something in a way that makes them think in a different way, that to me is almost divine, I would say.
Yes. I think that the reason why it is so beautiful when you have that moment of connection is because fundamentally we as humans exist in different places, in different perspectives, and so on. So probabilistically, if you think about humans as high-dimensional creatures within an even higher dimensional space, the probability that we bump into each other and can truly comprehend the experiences of the other is so astronomically rare that when it does happen, we should be celebrating it. I mean, this is my mathematical brain putting everything in terms of spatial order, but what I've realized so far in this conversation is that maybe there is nothing fundamentally so egregiously different about words and communication that it warrants my saying this, language is a completely alien field and I am here to learn what I can. Well, it seems like there are strong connections between language as expression, language as a statistical, logical structure, as well as the nuances and emotions embedded within language. And what I've realized recently is that my ability to understand what authors are saying to improve my reading comprehension has gone up when I have connected language to different aspects. For example, when I read a book, I no longer just read it once and then when I'm done, I'm done. When I'm reading, I will envision what the author is saying. I will imagine that the author is standing in front of me, speaking his or her ideas, and then it's like I'm interacting with the author. And also, when I read, sometimes I will jot down notes, I will draw diagrams of how different ideas interconnect, because I don't think reading is meant to be, you read it once and then you're done. It's not like food where you just download it and it's over. The book is always going to be there, even after you've read it, unlike food. So you can always go back to it, revisit the ideas, iterate upon it. It's very similar actually to how I look at code and mathematical proofs and ideas. Because one of the ways in which I improve my ability to comprehend technically challenging ideas is instead of just thinking I have to understand this on one go, I will visit it again tomorrow, I'm going to read it again over the weekend and so on. I'm going to go very slowly, line by line, until I've understood everything that it has. Because each line of code or each equation has a fundamental meaning that does take time for you to truly understand what it is saying. And I believe that's the same with words and just reading novels and whatever it is, because in today's world, there's always so much around us going on, and we don't really have time to read everything in detail, but I think it's very helpful for me, at least, to just look at a piece of text and read it very slowly and make sure that I've understood how the words work and how they connect with each other, and then I figured that I can remember more of what it is that I'm thinking about, because not only is it just words on a piece of paper, it's also how do they relate to each other. And in fact, correlations and the active relation is a graph theory concept. It's edges are different words, and vertices are how well they connect with each other. Oh, sorry, I mixed it up. See, in the English language, edges mean the line segments between dots, and the dots are called vertices. I always get that flipped because lines are supposed to be longer than dots, right? So I always call the lines vertices and the dots. Yeah, but you get the point. It's a fundamentally graph theoretical idea. So I think drawing associations between what I read on paper and what I see in the world around me and bridging that gap between words and reality, I think the graph is the solution to that problem.
I hear what you're saying, and I think if it comes down to the technicalities of the ways of approaching a text in order to better understand it or to better internalize it, to me it depends on the ultimate purpose in reading that text. So, for example, I think I have a very sharp delineation between nonfiction and fiction. I read nonfiction all the time, all day, every day for this work. I'm constantly reading articles, books, what have you, and when I do so, I generally do so with a highlighter in hand, literally or virtually, as the case may be, so that I can better hone in on those facts and those things that I'm trying to extract that I want to be able to remember and recall and find again later on. And I find it's even more helpful if I take a second order to that. So after highlighting and going through, for example, if I'm working on a documentary, after highlighting a book or an article, I will then go and actually transfer those highlighted sections into a document and make notes about them, or in some way coordinate those into some sort of structure that I can then draw upon when I am putting it together in my own narrative. Then I have to be able to take these different pieces and put them together in a way that makes sense. So that I find that process helpful, at least to me, to better coordinate and understand the information, internalize it, remember it, be able to regurgitate it later. But that isn't at all the way that I approach fiction. And I think it is because what I am doing when I approach a great work of fiction that I love as a work of art, I am approaching it more, of course, less for I have to remember the name and details of this particular character, and more so what it is telling me about the human experience. And is it informing my understanding of my own experience, and in what ways? And in that regard, you could read something when you're 18 years old and then come back to it when you're 28 years old and 38 years old and 40, and you could continue going back to it throughout your whole life and get different things each time. It doesn't mean that any one reading of those was right or wrong or was definitively the reading. It's just that you have a different perspective on it because you are in a different place in your human journey. And so it's a completely different mindset that I would approach most fiction most of the time, the caveat being, well, of course, sometimes when I'm watching fiction, it's for the purpose of the work that I'm doing in the nonfiction setting. So is this propaganda that's conditioning us for the transhuman future or something like that? In which case I will go and make notes and approach it in that way. But if I'm approaching it as a work of art, it is essentially, what is this speaking to my experience of the human condition, and how does it inform that?
Mm-hmm. I think we've pretty much answered the second question, which would be, what's your strategy for extracting knowledge and meaning when you read? Do you pay attention to every word, just a few keywords, or the beginning and the end? We've taken care of the extracting the knowledge.
Yes.
With respect to fiction,
right.
Yes.
Okay.
With respect to fiction and nonfiction, for me, nonfiction is pretty straightforward. I can draw the mental map in my head. In terms of fiction, I think I am actually more formulaic because I have less ability to appreciate words. I just think I was born a mathematician, you know. When I listen to songs and they're memorable to me, or they're sad to me, or they speak to me, 95% of the reason is because the melody was a certain way. Mm-hmm. I don't really care about the words. You could replace the words with something funny or something silly or something I don't know, and I would still think it's a very heartfelt song, or it's a very energetic song. Mm-hmm. So, poetry doesn't appeal to me much. But speaking of fiction, I do want to ask, how do you read between the lines to detect implicit intent, subtle emotions, and hidden meanings?
Before I get to that, may I ask you a question? Is there any poem or song lyric or book or short story or anything that has ever resonated with you on that level of, oh my God, that's exactly what I think, or that's the human experience that I'm having, or something along those lines? Is there anything that's ever really caught you in that same way that a melody, for example, can catch you?
The same way that a melody can. I don't think so.
Interesting. Okay. I would say if there was, that might be the starting point of a kernel for exploration and deepening. But if there isn't, then it might actually be. I don't know. Obviously, I'm not an expert, but maybe there is a neurobiological chemical impediment or difference at any rate. And some people are simply not able to do that. I find that fascinating because there are certainly words and phrases and things that have stuck with me for decades that really resonated with me that I find so fascinating. Anyway, okay. Sorry, the question one more time.
Yes. How do you read between the lines to detect implicit intent, subtle emotions, and hidden meanings?
That is an excellent question, but one that I'm not sure I'm able to articulate. How do I read between the lines? I do read between the lines, but how do I do that? Well, to some extent, I mean, I don't do this consciously, but I think at whatever I go into, I think I come generally with a preconception of what the intent of the author is in a given work of communication. And that is going to be informed by a number of things, and sometimes I will be wrong, but generally I will carry in some sort of, it is almost like a filter through which you're reading something. So when I go in and I'm reading something from some foreignpolicy.com or some place that I am going to associate with, oh, this is going to be an establishment propaganda outlet that's trying to foist establishment propaganda on me, I will go in with that filter and I will see when they use... This is a point, actually, I've made explicitly on the podcast before. I can't remember the exact title I used, but I made a video something along the lines of, I am a free trade, sustainable development globalist, or something along those lines, which is a deliberately provocative title for my viewers, because, of course, those are the things that we are against, right? And my point in that video was, no, all of these terms have specific identifiable meanings, but depending who is using them and in what context, you can read between the lines. And when you hear one of these people at World Economic Forum or Bilderberg or whatever talking about globalism and the perils of populism, they're using those words in a specific way to hit specific buttons for their specific audience, so that their audience will know, we should be on this side of this issue. We should be against that sort of thing. And so I think I tend to approach, again, nonfiction with that filter. With fiction, I'm not sure how I would approach, because obviously I understand when I'm reading a poem or something, it's not necessarily about the literal words that are being used so much as the feeling they are intended to evoke, or the way that the language goes together to create mellifluous sound can be an important part of poetry, obviously. So if there is a method by which I approach that, I cannot articulate it. I don't know if I'm that methodical with regards to that.
It could just be subconscious, because when I see a poem, I'm sure that poems are just, by default, by their definition, they're going to have many different layers of hidden meaning, and perhaps it's the fact that all the words start with F, or that the characters behave a certain way, but in any case, I'm completely lost. So I don't know why it is that certain people in class, whenever they see a certain poem or read it a couple of times, they can say, oh, the author intended this, this, and that. And
you know what? Maybe it is a muscle that needs to be exercised in order to grow. And an example of that occurs to me, I remember from my 10th grade English class, so this would have been, I don't know, I was 15 or something. I remember we were reading a short story, and it was about I believe a farmer, if I can remember the details, a farmer who had had some horrible threshing accident or something and essentially lost both his arms or his hands or something like that. And that was, so when he slept with his wife at night, he would sort of wrap his legs around her awkwardly, but he couldn't hold her anymore, right? And our teacher was trying to draw this out of us. Okay, that is what is explicitly, literally true about this character in this situation. But what does this mean? What is happening in this story? And it took forever. It was like pulling teeth. But eventually one student raised his hand. Well, he's losing his grip on his wife, right? And that was sort of the main theme of the story. It was about them falling out of love and what have you. The literal incarnation of that was he literally had no arms. He couldn't literally hold her anymore. But the idea was he was losing his touch with her, right? And, it's that kind of thing. Once you see that for the first time, then you are, I would imagine, better prepared the next time you're starting to think about what is the association? What does this mean on a deeper sense? Again, it's like a muscle. You train it and you do it over and over and you will get better at it.
Yeah, perhaps, because the first thing that came to my mind was that he still loves his wife because he's still trying to wrap his legs around her.
Yeah.
But I definitely
need to read the whole story. I think it made sense in the context, but anyway.
I see. Well, perhaps it is a muscle, and I just need to go back and I need to retrain that and see what I can do with it. This question is probably the worst out of the 6. It's number 4. How can I read books and articles faster? Actually, I'm not slow, but knowing I will have to sit down for hours to read the average 300-page book demoralizes me.
Yeah, I don't have a speed reading method. I have never taken a speed reading course. I don't think I'm a particularly fast reader. I don't think I'm a slow reader either. I'm somewhere in the comfortable middle. I don't think the speed of my reading has ever been enough of an issue for me to ever think about it or to care about it. So I certainly don't have any tips or tricks or hacks for you, other than to say that, again, depending on the context of what I'm reading, sometimes, yes, when I really want to do a deep, close reading of something, I will go very slowly and very carefully and very, very methodically. Or if I want to enjoy a beautiful work of art, I do not try to rush things along. I take it at whatever speed it's going to come to me. But there are times when I definitely want just to get the the general idea, and I will do scanning. And again, probably like a muscle that you can develop. I think if I had to articulate my method when I come to scanning, just yesterday I was scanning through an article. It was a lengthy article. I knew I didn't need to read every single word of it in order to get it. So I believe, if I'm trying to articulate what was I doing, I think I was just reading the first sentence of each paragraph, and the ones that I thought were going to be interesting, I would read the paragraph. But if, I get the idea, I get the points, I can fill in the blanks, and that's generally the way I would approach scan reading.
I see. The reason why I thought it was a horrible question is because the answer is always going to be it depends on what you're reading. And for me, I think my reading speed is fast. I mean, I've tested it online. It's top, 20% of the population or something like that. So I wouldn't struggle with this. It's just, sometimes for me, I figure that when I do set a threshold for myself in which I say I want to reach this threshold or I want to be able to write this piece of code in this amount of time, it ends up not being my best work. Sometimes the best work is actually when I don't care about the time aspect as much, and I just say, let me make sure I solidly understand the concept. And once I do that, suddenly progress seems lightning fast.
There's a golden median, as always, though, because yes, I certainly get that, but also you could take it too far in the other extreme, which is to say, I'm not going to worry about the time and whatever time it takes, and that, I think, provokes a certain laziness. The only thing that I can say for certain is that I don't think I would have produced nearly as much content. I hate that word, content. Speaking of words. But anyway, I would not have produced nearly as many hours of audio and video content over the decades if I had spent too much time, been too precious with it, allowed myself any amount of time. I do set myself deadlines for production, and I try to make them realistic, and if I don't meet them, oh well, but I do try to have certain deadlines because I think it is important, simply because I have had the experience many, many times of looking back at something that I've produced and go, I would never have gotten that done if I just done it when inspiration strikes or when I feel like it or at my own pace. No, I did it because I have to get this done by next Friday because I want to get it done by next Friday, and I get it done, and it turns out to be actually pretty good. So I think there is a median balance to be found there.
Yeah, well, there's 2 points that come to mind. The first one is, what I've discovered is that it's very important it is much better to have many rough drafts before your final iteration and to consider ideas over a longer period of time than it is to shoot for one perfect replica at once. Because when it comes to writing essays, I've realized that when I just write it the night before, there are just ideas that don't come into my head until moments later. Before we were having this conversation, I thought maybe I could just spontaneously come onto the show and then I would have things mapped out. But in reality, I gave myself time. I thought on the first day, this is what I thought about when I thought about improving the verbal. And then over time, as I took a few walks, as I wrote some research, as I did some problems, I realized that there were other ideas that I could link to. So, sometimes people say procrastinators. Well, I think there's arguments for procrastination actually not being so bad of a habit, but I think the main deprivation effect it has is that ideas don't come to you at once. It does take an amount of time for them to trickle in. And I mean, when I'm writing, I just write. Whatever I think of in my mind, I just put it out there. And then I worry about the organization and the refinement a bit later because I need that first draft to come out. Obviously, we're on this podcast right now. I'm not going to get a second chance. I'm not worried, I'm not here to make myself the most refined and glib, and I'm just here to express my thoughts as they are, so that this could be something that I look back on later, or that the Corbettiers could read and say, I think this is a good point, I think this could be improved, and so on, so that this is like a work that can constantly be adapted. And the second point is with regards to the time. Sometimes I'm not the type of person really to, if I set myself a deadline, I might be able to meet it. But if I don't, sometimes that allows me to tap into something fundamental about the task that I'm given, in which I feel very fulfilled. Like I have discovered this is exactly how it works. And then suddenly everything else happens like lightning. Because I remember when, as an undergrad, I was working on a research project that involved vehicle routing. I didn't have any idea how to write the code. I would look at it, and in 3 months, I literally made 0 progress. And I was obviously very disappointed with myself. But I thought back to what the master's student and the professor said, which is, when you look at a piece of code, you might as well go slowly. Make sure you really understand what's happening. And I didn't say I have to write a paper by the end of the year. I said my goal right now is just to make sure that I understand the code, because in my experience, once I fundamentally grasp the core of a situation, I will surprise myself in how fast I can actually go. And it turns out that once I understood how column generation works, I was able to create novel techniques on column generation, make dual column generation, which is two simultaneous different problem sets that are put together, and I actually finished up my work 3 months in advance, despite the fact that I wasted 3+ months. So
yeah, but
perhaps it is just...
there is a difference in terms of what you are generating. So if you're generating something that is practical, that has a certain answer that is going to either be right or wrong, that does a certain practical thing in the real world, then yes. But when there is an artistic / aesthetic nuance to it, I think that that's where the potential for genuine procrastination comes in. Because I know personally, I could be so precious with my work, and oh my God, it has to be just every word just perfect, and oh, this it isn't inspiring me today. And if I go too much in that direction, I'll never get anything done, because there is, I think, a practical element to the work that I'm producing, but there is certainly an artistic / aesthetic element to it. And if I allow the artistic aesthetic element to be my main focus, then I could spend, years producing a single podcast, and by God, it's going to be a great podcast if I ever get it done, but probably not worth that amount of effort.
Yeah, I figured that when it's a mathematical concept for me, it has a natural termination. But the arts and aesthetics tend to be more open-ended.
Exactly. There is no actual endpoint to the production of a work of art. There's never a point where you could say, now it is actually physically done. It's finished. There's no way there can always be improvement, or you could do this, or you could do that. There's a never-ending series of possibilities for change.
At some point, you have to realize, I like the work where it is, I'm going to cut it off. Because I think a research paper, or one of my friends told me, was that, what's the difference between good musicians and great musicians? Great musicians, when they play a certain note a certain way, or they sing something in a certain fashion, they know instinctively, that's correct, that's where I'm going to stop it, I'm not going to rehearse it again, that's just how it is. Obviously, you can say, well, that's arbitrary, how did you know, or why did you not sing this G sharp just a little bit sharper? Well, intuitively, you have that sense of completion within you. It's like when I was painting, I used to do acrylic paints when I was younger. And the teacher would often come up to me and say, that's not finished, you need to finish this edge. And then once I would finish it, the teacher says, you don't think that's finished? I think it's pretty much done. And we would look at it from afar, and it seems like, well, the painting's pretty much good. That's more of a subjective, intuitive sense of how you would look at art in itself. And for me, I think...
but subjective in the most personal sense. And that's why I think that knowing your own aim is the most important part of that, because that delineates when you are done. Right? There is no objective answer for any sort of aesthetic, artistic production for the final stopping point, but it has to come from the sense of knowing what it is that you want so that you can recognize when you've achieved it. So defining your aim is absolutely the first thing that needs to be done when you're producing something along those lines.
Yes, I agree. I think it all depends on what threshold you set for yourself. And I've noticed that personally, I tend to be a bit more scrappy, where I say, you know what, I have a product, let's push it out and let's see what happens. Turns out to be great in entrepreneurship, not so great in academia, but that's just a way of interpreting how far you want your work to be. Number 5, this is an interesting one. When I was in high school and I wanted to recite the digits of pi, or I wanted to, some things I like to do revolve around geography because it's shapes, right? So, sometimes I would have my friends draw a little 1x1 box on a world map, and then I would be asked, where is this 1x1 box? And I would usually get it correct. That's a type of spatial challenge. But I always had problem memorizing poems because we had to do a poem memorization for one class. And I took a whole week, and I was still messing up the words. And I think that this does connect to my general inability to remember words as fervently and with as much conviction as I remember images and shapes. One time I was at the doctor's office. I remembered an advertisement. I knew the colors, I knew the phone number, etc. But I couldn't even remember a single word. So I gotta ask you, how can I improve verbal recall? Just the ability to come up with, it's when you've read enough books and then you can say, oh, this book that I read at this time called this by this author once said, and so on. I struggle with that.
If but some vengeful god would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. Then would I bear it, clench myself and die, half-eased in... Oh, fuck. Ugh. Half-eased in... No. Then would I
Where's
bear
that
it,
from?
clench myself and die. Anyway, well, I almost got it. Hap by Thomas Hardy. Why? How can I even start to recall that poem? Specifically, because I set myself the challenge last January of creating a song out of that poem. So I set that to music, and so I had those words going around in my head over and over and over, trying to find a melody that would encapsulate that, and what am I going for? So that poem in particular almost made it into my long-term memory. Anyway, I could do it if I really tried. But yeah, I don't think I'm the type that has that kind of incredible recall for specific words unless they are incredibly profoundly impactful on me. But I don't think so. I think my recall, my memory is not predicated on remembering the specific order of specific words. It is about remembering concepts. Like, I can tell you about this book that I read about this subject, and I can tell you what the author was saying about it. I can't tell you the specific order of the words that he used to say it, generally speaking.
Same idea of just associating words with something else, anything else. I mean, for you, it was a song. And for me, perhaps it could be numbers, or it could be the way that words sound in different contexts. I don't have this problem in Chinese, by the way. Maybe it's because they're just characters. So when I see them, it's literally images, too.
And tell me if this is folklore or true, but there are no dyslexic Chinese, right? Is dyslexia a thing when it comes to kanji?
Well, there was one funny cartoon that I saw a while back, which was about the case for simplifying Chinese characters, because the Chinese that you see in Japanese actually, where there is a difference between traditional, which is more complicated, and simplified Chinese, usually Japan takes the traditional one. And a Chinese cartoon that was drawn by Mao's communists to inspire the people to simplify their writing system because it was so hard to read and it was so complicated was, there was a guy who had adapted to simplified Chinese and he could write 100 characters a minute, and then right next to him at another table was a guy who was writing traditional and he was struggling with, does this little stroke go here or where does it go? I think that okay, I actually don't know whether or not they're dyslexic Chinese, but I don't think dyslexia can be in the same sense, right? Because you're not dealing with the order of letters, right? There is no such, there is a spelling bee equivalent, and that's, a judge will give you a very obscure character, and you can ask for the definition and so on, and then you have to write the character, sure.
Right.
But
is that counted on stroke order and stroke direction as well?
Oh, I don't care about stroke order at all.
Yeah, but they do in Japan, let me tell you.
Oh, they absolutely do. I've seen it all.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. It is just that's just a concept that doesn't exist in an ideogrammic language because, letters representing sounds is different than ideograms. Yes. Yeah.
What also doesn't exist in most ideogrammic languages is uppercase and lowercase.
Yeah. Never thought about it, but yeah.
And I thought that was actually a great thing.
Okay, I don't know about Chinese. I know about Japanese, but in order to stress certain words, instead of representing them in kanji, they would spell them out in katakana as a.
Oh, and would they also add the little dash?
So, like in Chinese, how do you stress a word?
How do you stress a word? It depends on the context, really. It depends on what you're trying to say, and as with English, if you stress different characters, you can also change the meaning of a sentence. Yeah. Like, I didn't steal it. I didn't steal it. I didn't. Right.
I don't mean like I mean like graphically. When you're writing, how do you stress a word? How do you show?
You don't.
Okay.
There's no way to show. I mean, English. See, some languages love having markers, like little. I don't know what they're called. Acute accents, I think.
Yeah.
No, the one that goes up, right, to show where the stress is. In Greek, you are forced to add stress to literally every word that has more than one syllable. In Russian, it's usually done for instruction purposes, and in English, actually, I think Japanese and Korean manuals on how to read and write English do have the strokes, but they have to disappear when you're actually doing it.
Right.
Yeah. And there are certain implicit traits within language that do exist. I think that actually, when I listen to the podcast and what we talked about, it will pretty much wrap up the sixth question, which would have been, how do I increase my overall engagement with and affinity for words and verbal IQ? And I think the answer is, well, just listen to the conversation that we just had, re-listen to it, write down ideas and see what we have. Because I think that this Solutions Watch is more about a work in progress. It's me trying to find ways to improve my relationship with words fundamentally. And I think the biggest takeaway from this has to be that words are not that different from graph theory. That's my big takeaway. Is that you can represent it in graph.
Of trying to map reality. It's just mapping in a completely different terrain, essentially.
Yeah. It's just because there is a linguistics competition. It's one of the big high school Olympiads, and usually you're faced with an unknown language, and you're usually told that some of these words correspond to this word in English, and I give you a foreign sentence, and now you tell me what the sentence means, and half the words you've never seen before. And your goal is to decipher the meaning, or linguistically, syntactically, how do you get there? But even if I believe that there are ways in which I can interpret words in a more graphical and statistical manner, I still believe that there is something fundamentally emotional about words and how they're used that doesn't exist in mathematics. I think that if I was to speak in a certain way, or if I was to watch a certain movie, or read a certain passage in a book, there is a more just, when I walk into a room of people, I can feel the atmosphere of what people are like, and I can predict what they're going to say to a small extent, and think about what they're going to react if I do this or do that. That's more of emotional intelligence. I think that exists in words in a way that does not exist in the quantitative
Well, I'm trying to
field.
think, okay, so if I gave an artist, a visual artist, the cue, okay, paint me love, I'm sure they could at least interpret that in some way and paint something that to at least to them and maybe to other people conveys that concept. Same with a writer. Write me a story that conveys the concept of love. Okay, you can definitely put that into words. It might not be one-to-one directly from the author's mind into the reader, but that concept at least exists somewhere in the linguistic space. Go to a mathematician. Show me an equation of love. Is that conceivable?
Is there an equation?
What does that mean? I don't even know how to begin approaching that.
The answer is always 42. That's the answer.
Now that is a literary reference. There you go.
Yeah, that's probably the only one I can catch.
Because it's numeral.
Exactly.
And I'm not going to explain it for anyone out there who doesn't know what 42 is.
Of course.
You should know.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when you said, what was it? I believe it was in the President Trump documentary in which you said that if you don't understand Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy, I doubt we can truly be friends.
It's true.
So I do have some...
That's my sense of humor in a nutshell.
Yeah, I do have some reading to do. I think that wraps up the questions on how to become better with respect to internalizing words as a fundamental concept. I may or may not have to revise my theory that the world can be explained through mathematics. I'm just very fond of saying that because at MIT, we're mostly mathematicians. So to say something like that in this type of nerdy environment is considered socially acceptable. But I do think that many fields, such as if you wanted to write a law, or if you wanted to energize a large amount of people to perform a certain policy or act, or to write to your senator, the type of skill that you would need there, well, you can mathematically optimize who you're going to reach out to, or how am I going to plan this on the grand level, but it does take a different skill set to convey yourself most convincingly. And I don't think it can be done by being loud and extroverted alone. I think you do need sophistication in terms of how you word things and how they go. And one of the problems I've noticed recently is around the world, people are reading less, and the size of vocabulary is slipping. I mean, you can see this in many ways. I think English has become a lot more simplified. Words are becoming obscure or archaic, and it's very easy to forget words, but it's very hard to get them back. Or I think the speed at which we're losing words is faster than the speed at which we can create new words like Riz, which isn't quite as elegant or expressive as the word that we have.
To be fair, isn't a new word. It's just a shortening of charisma. It's meant to represent what was formerly represented by a longer word. It's mostly about contraction. But no, you're exactly right. And let me just stress this. I wish I could remember now. I was actually thinking about it the other day because I knew we were going to have this conversation. But I absolutely can tell when I am reading the words of someone who is a reader versus someone who is not a reader. And there's something, it isn't even about grammatical correctness or whatever. It's about people understanding or not understanding the ways that certain collocations are employed, or the meaning of certain phrases, or where they come from. There are certain times when people will spell something wrong in a way that I understand. Oh, you know what that sounds like, but you don't know what it means, etc., etc. There's a lot of tells, so I can always tell when someone is a reader. And unfortunately, as you say, fewer and fewer people these days are readers.
Yes. Well, James, if you ever go to my essays on adamdeng.com, can you tell if I'm a reader or not?
You know what? I'm going to give myself that task, and I will let you know.
Yes, and see whether or not I'm a reader. I hope your answer should be no. I don't think I've read nearly enough. I mean, in terms of writing ideas,
at the point at which large language models can produce poetry and art and stories that make us feel emotions, then maybe you're right. Maybe it is all mathematical and it can all be represented and put into constructs and then regurgitated on command, and humans are just biological robots that can be programmed by certain neurolinguistic processing, etc., and all of this airy-fairy love and all that nonsense doesn't exist. I tend to think that's not the case, but hey, we'll find out.
I've also considered the question of whether AI can perfectly replicate what humans do. I mean, if humans give a concert, the AI can simply take a sensor and see what hertz the vibrations were, and then just, if you take enough samples, it sounds like the real thing. But I have been considering what it is that makes human and AI different. And my answer would have to be to co-opt a David Icke term, creative imagination. I think that if humans were given a blank piece of paper, whether it's a baby or it's an adult, we want to do something with it. Maybe fold it up into a paper airplane, or draw our thoughts, or so on. If you give AI no prompt at all, the AI is just not going to do anything, right? If you give an AI a blank piece of paper and you don't tell it, draw something, and you just simply leave it there, the AI is not going to do anything. I think the reason why our world is where it has gotten to right now is because humans fundamentally have an ability to create and discover and to want to know the secrets of the universe. AI doesn't. I've never seen an AI say, what is the secret of life? I've always say humans tell AI what is the secret of life, and then the AI will try to get an answer. I think fundamentally, the power of creativity is what has brought us here, and it is a very fundamental property that AI just never will have. When people say, when AlphaGo was developed, and AlphaGo was able to beat the strongest Go players, and they said, oh, the AI learned, right? Reinforcement learning. Because if you go a certain place, it can be associated with a certain negative weight, and the AI fine-tunes over a large number of horizons and knows where to go and where not to go and can calculate down the tree. I wouldn't consider that AI learning. Okay, sure, the AI has learned from itself, but has it broken the rules of Go? Has it created a new game? No, it hasn't. It has simply done better than what humans can do by reading the tree further down. It's like in chess or in any board game, when you read the tree of possible moves and where they end up, the AI, I mean, obviously Go, you can move 100 plus times. Nobody will ever be able to construct a tree like that. But the machine knows how to heuristify and simplify things, and that's how it decides where to branch down. Has it learned? No, I think it's just adapted the rules of mathematics. Some human programmed it to have these types of heuristics. I mean, at the end of the day, I always think about, can you have a standalone army of just robots without any human intervention doing things? Perhaps, but are they creating anything, or are they just playing in the game that we've developed?
Okay, that's such an important point, and I'm glad you made it. Absolutely. The motivation to produce anything, to do anything without being commanded to do so, it does seem like it is a differentiation, at least at this point. So I would leave with one observation and one recommendation. The observation is that meaning is created, not discovered. And I have yet to see the AI creating meaning. And secondly, I would recommend the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. I think maybe that is part of what you're grappling with. I think some of those ideas might be contained in there. For people who don't know, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, he went to study under Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell said, this is the greatest logical thinker. He's a genius. He will probably produce, this great work in the future. He ends up producing a single work called the Logico Tractatus Philosophico. I'm butchering that, but anyway, and Wittgenstein is a young man, but he retires. He's like, that's it. This is all that needs to be said. I have put it into this is the logical conclusion of what philosophy is and how it works and everything that we need to know. A few decades later, he comes back and he's like, you know what, actually, and then he starts to essentially pioneer a whole different branch of philosophy that we're still moving forward within, which is language games, and essentially how context of language in various language games, as he called them, like in a courtroom versus a conversation like we're having versus a conversation I'd have with my wife versus a conversation you'd have with your coworker, etc., etc. Those are all language games. And the context of that is where meaning is created, and also the reality of the world, in a sense, is created through the various language games. Anyway, Wittgenstein's career as a whole is probably instructive along the lines of what we're talking about today.
Well, the note that I'll end on is perhaps a simple note, but it's that when you look at the different fields of life and different ways to interpret the human experience, they are more similar than you would always believe. Because for me, I like to divide things. I like to categorize and pattern things, and then see maybe between this vertex and this vertex, I can draw an edge. There we go. Now that's the correct one. Now I'm starting to realize that not only is it that the same techniques can be used to analyze different modes of thought. For example, close reading text, like a verbal-based or literature-based text, is similar to close reading code, is similar to deriving a mathematical equation. Not only are they similar, I think that the ways in which they express themselves fundamentally are not all that different either. What I mean by that is, I used to think of words as a literature-like, emotion-like pursuit, but actually, even when you look at the best of poems, the words themselves do have an embedding someplace in embedding space. And you can't really, the fundamental building blocks of a good piece of music or of a good poem are not all that different from the fundamental building blocks of an engineering equation or optimizing the design of a chainsaw. It's just that the ways in which we associate them are perhaps very, very different. Because if I look at a cell phone, I'm going to give it the number 74. And when you look at a cell phone, perhaps you're thinking about the different nature of what a cell phone means to you. But I think that the building blocks at the very base level are still the same. And this is entering uncharted territory that I'm going to spend weeks distilling the conversation that we had and coming up with ideas for how I can streamline this. Maybe I develop a new theory about how this all fits together. But I think that it's been a great conversation. I certainly have.
I am looking forward to that update, let me tell you.
Yes,
and
my mind is complete.
I know the MIT SOI is, or at least the website is defunct at this point, right? Mm-hmm. So what is the best place for people to find out about you and your work?
Me, AdamDeng.com. You can contact me. I list my email several times. I encourage cold emails and unsolicited emails and just having discussions. My mind is blown. This is the first time I've said it in a while. I sit at the MIT math lecture and I look at the equations, I can at least say, this is how the equation works, and this is what I can do, and then I spend 7 hours in the dojo just training myself to get ready for the next lecture. But this time, I think, something fundamental, like the truth of the paper has broken in, and it's going to take me a while to recover and to put all my thoughts together, but I think that when I come out at the other side of it, I am going to be looking at the world in a new way, because one of my New Year's resolutions in what is possibly the only square year I will ever live through in this physical form, was to improve my grasp of the verbal and to be able to relate words which I've isolated in a box for so long with other pursuits, and to think about the nature of how different modes of communication and different ways of interpreting the world can be put together. And I hope that that is an exercise that I'm able to tackle, and it's an exercise that will lead me to put together my different interests. Like I do research in high-dimensional space. Maybe that can help me build better algorithms for various applications, and possibly that can help me develop a site for analyzing the law or gathering together what people think about the law. And there's many services in the practical world that have not yet been created. And I think one of the biggest areas for arbitrage, so to speak, is in the freedom movement, just needing to come together and to agree on ideas, or be able to have more power and scale in getting our message out there is one of the challenges. And knowing in this space, what exactly is it that I'm supposed to read? Because when I look at the alternative viewpoints, there's just so much stuff out there, and it's really hard to distill it into. You've done it. I think you have open source education, where you have specifically, economy, government corruption, and so on, so that people know how to navigate the roadmap. I think that with my knowledge of graph theory, I want to be able to come up with ways in which we can better structure and optimize what we do. And I want to do that for myself first, though, because otherwise, what's the point? But my mind is, I'm just, at the start of the conversation, right, I was talking 2-3 minutes. I'm confident coming out with how to introduce myself. Now it's like I'm broken down. The math, there's no math in my brain anymore. It's just all these ideas everywhere. So
Well, then mission accomplished. All right. Well, as I say, this is truly what my bread and butter issue and what I'm interested in. So I'm
yeah.
thankful for you bringing it up. And as I say, I'm genuinely interested in what you come up with from
Yes,
this
yes.
update.
I am happy to be deconstructed. My goal was not to have a flawless conversation at all. It was just to have my fundamental assumptions on the different interplay of subjects reevaluated. And I wanted that deconstruction to happen, and I think that we have it happening. So, yes, I will keep you updated on what I eventually come up with.
All right. Thank you. Let's leave it there. Adam Deng, thank you for your time.
Of course. Thank you for having me on.